When I got home after 8 months overseas, the first thing I noticed wasn't my house. It was a giant gray metal shed sitting where my front lawn used to breathe. At first, I honestly thought one of my neighbors had parked a temporary storage building in the wrong place. But the fresh concrete, the brand new paver walkway leading straight into my yard, and the smell of wet paint told me this thing wasn't temporary at all. The woman who built it spent over $7,000 making sure it looked permanent. She just never imagined an old county document tucked away in my late father's basement would eventually cost her every penny. My name is Ryan Mercer, and until all this happened, I would have told you I was the easiest neighbor anyone could ask for. I bought my little corner property outside Cedar Ridge, Tennessee, because I liked peace, wide yards, and the kind of neighborhood where people waved instead of stared. Before being deployed with the National Guard, I'd spent nearly 6 years fixing up the place one weekend at a time. My father had passed the house down to me, and every fence post, every maple tree, every patch of grass reminded me of working beside him when I was younger. He had one habit that used to drive my mother crazy. He never threw away paperwork, old surveys, tax receipts, utility maps, faded engineering drawings. Everything went into labeled boxes stacked neatly in the basement. Back then, I used to laugh and tell him nobody needed papers from the Reagan administration anymore. He'd just smile and say, "One day, those papers will know more than any lawyer." I didn't understand what he meant until the day I came home. Across the street lived Denise Holloway, the HOA treasurer. Denise wasn't loud exactly. She was something worse. She smiled while telling people what they couldn't do. Wrong mailbox color, trash can visible after sunset, Christmas lights still hanging on January 3rd. She treated every HOA meeting like she was presiding over Congress, clipboard tucked under one arm, quoting bylaws nobody else had actually read. Most neighbors rolled their eyes, but paid the fines just to avoid the headache. Since I was deployed most of the year, I rarely dealt with her directly. Apparently, she took my absence as an opportunity. I hadn't even unpacked my truck before walking over to her house. Workers were loading garden tools into the enormous aluminum shed, laughing like they'd just finished a successful project. Denise spotted me before I reached the porch. She looked almost surprised to see me alive. "Ryan," she said with a practiced smile. "Welcome home." "Long trip?" "Long enough," I answered, pointing toward the shed. "Can you explain why half of it is sitting on my property?" She barely glanced over her shoulder. "Oh, that. The gardening club needed storage. The board approved it while you were gone." I blinked, honestly waiting for the punchline. "You approved building on my land?" She shrugged. "Well, technically, the property lines around here have always been confusing. Besides, nobody objected during the meeting." "I wasn't exactly available," I said. "I was stationed in Eastern Europe." She gave another little shrug, almost bored. "That's unfortunate, but community projects can't wait forever." Then came the sentence that stayed in my head for weeks. "Think of it as contributing to the neighborhood." I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe someone had actually said those words with a straight face. "Denise," I said quietly, "you don't contribute somebody else's property." Her smile disappeared for just a second before returning even wider. "The HOA has already approved everything." Then she closed the door. That night I barely slept. Every time I looked out my kitchen window, I saw that ugly gray building sitting there like it owned the place. My anger wasn't really about the shed. It was about what it represented. I'd spent months sleeping on military cots halfway across the world while someone back home decided my absence meant my rights had expired. The next morning, I hired a surveyor. While waiting for his schedule, I went into my basement looking for my father's old property records, mostly hoping to find the original survey. Dust covered every box, and the air smelled like old paper and cedar shelves. Hours passed before I found a weathered folder labeled simply Drainage 1980. Inside was a folded county engineering map, yellow with age but perfectly readable. I spread it across my workbench and immediately noticed thick blue lines running along the edge of my lot. Beneath them sat a typed document referencing a permanent drainage easement recorded decades before I was even born. I read it once, then twice, then a third time because I honestly couldn't believe what I was seeing. According to the county filing, a 15-foot drainage corridor crossed exactly where Denise's brand new shed now stood, and the language couldn't have been clearer. No permanent structures of any kind were ever permitted within that easement, regardless of ownership or HOA approval. I leaned back in my father's old workshop chair and laughed louder than I had in months. For the first time since coming home, I wasn't angry anymore, because I realized this was no longer an argument between neighbors. It had quietly become a conversation between Denise and the county government. Send Part 2, and I'll continue seamlessly with the county investigation. Denise's desperate attempts to save the shed, and the story's biggest turning point. The county surveyor arrived 3 days later carrying a weathered orange tripod and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from measuring land for 30 years. He barely said a dozen words while setting up his equipment, but I watched his eyebrows climb higher every few minutes as he compared the electronic readings against the old county map I had laid across the hood of my truck. Denise stood in her driveway with her arms folded, pretending she wasn't paying attention, although every few seconds she'd glance over while talking into her phone. Finally, the surveyor walked toward me, tapped the corner of the map with one finger, then pointed straight at the shed. "Your father kept good records," he said. "This easement hasn't changed since 1980. So I'm not crazy?" I asked. He actually chuckled. "No, sir. That building shouldn't exist." Those 5 words felt better than any argument I could have won myself. I thanked him, collected the official survey packet, and drove directly to the county planning office. The woman behind the front desk looked like she'd processed complaints from angry homeowners for 20 years. But when she saw the easement paperwork and the updated survey side by side, her expression changed. "Give me a few minutes," she said, disappearing into the back office. A county inspector named Harold Benton came out carrying a legal pad. He studied the documents quietly before asking, "Did the HOA approve this?" I nodded. Harold sighed the way mechanics sigh when someone says they ignored the check engine light for 6 months. "HOAs can create neighborhood rules," he said. "They don't erase county easements." He scheduled an inspection for the following Tuesday. Word traveled through the neighborhood faster than I expected. By Sunday afternoon, people walking their dogs suddenly found excuses to stroll past my house. Some stopped to ask questions. Others simply stared at the oversized shed like they were looking at a car wreck. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, leaned across the fence and said, "You know, Denise told everyone you donated that strip of land." I almost laughed. "Really?" He nodded. "She said you wanted to support the gardening club while you were overseas." I looked back at the shed and shook my head. "Funny. Nobody ever asked me." "Mr. Batten?" Alvarez smiled awkwardly. "Most of us figured something wasn't adding up." That conversation taught me something important. Denise hadn't simply crossed her property line. She'd built a story around it, one that made her look generous and me look absent. If nobody questioned her version long enough, eventually it would become the truth. Tuesday morning arrived with dark clouds hanging low over the neighborhood. Harold pulled up in a White County pickup just after 9. Denise walked outside before he even stepped onto the property, carrying a thick binder full of HOA documents. "Everything here was approved by our architectural committee," she announced before Harold introduced himself. He accepted the binder politely without opening it. "Ma'am," he said, "today I'm inspecting compliance with county regulations. Our association has authority over improvements." Harold smiled patiently. "Not over drainage easements." Denise's confidence slipped just enough for me to notice. Harold spent nearly an hour measuring setbacks, photographing the concrete foundation, checking elevation markers, and comparing every measurement against the survey. I stayed back, answering questions only when he asked them. Denise, on the other hand, followed him like a defense attorney, objecting to every sentence. "The maps are outdated. The previous owner never complained. The neighborhood benefits from this building." Harold never argued. He simply kept writing, Finally, he closed his notebook. Mrs. Holloway, he said calmly, this structure occupies a protected drainage easement and violates required setbacks. I'll be issuing a notice of violation. Denise's face flushed bright red. You're telling me a document from 40 years ago overrides an HOA vote? Harold looked directly at her. Ma'am, county law doesn't expire because a board raises its hands. That line spread through the neighborhood before sunset. 3 days later, the certified letter arrived. Denise was ordered to remove the structure immediately or face $500 in weekly fines until compliance was achieved. The notice also warned that if future flooding occurred because the easement had been obstructed, she could be held financially responsible for resulting property damage. Suddenly, this wasn't about a garden club anymore. It was about liability. The following Thursday was the monthly HOA meeting, and for the first time in years, every folding chair in the clubhouse was occupied. People who'd never attended before showed up carrying coffee just to watch. Denise sat at the front table beside the HOA president, trying to project confidence. But I noticed the stack of violation papers beside her binder. When homeowner comments began, she stood first. This situation has been exaggerated, she announced. The association approved this project in good faith. Someone from the back asked, "Did you know it was on Ryan's property?" She ignored the question. "We have the authority to grant reasonable exceptions." Before anyone else could respond, the clubhouse doors opened. Harold walked inside wearing his county badge. Every conversation stopped instantly. He wasn't there because I invited him. He was there because the HOA had requested clarification. Harold stepped to the front and spoke in the same calm voice he'd used during the inspection. The county's position is straightforward. Associations may establish neighborhood standards, but they cannot authorize permanent construction inside recorded public easements. Any vote suggesting otherwise carries no legal effect. Denise interrupted. Surely there's an appeal process. There is, Harold replied. You may appeal the citation. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Then he finished his sentence. But unless the county records themselves are legally vacated, which they cannot be under these circumstances, the violation remains. The room fell completely silent. Even people who usually defended the HOA looked uncomfortable. One elderly homeowner quietly asked, "So, the shed has to come down?" Harold nodded once. Yes. After the meeting, Denise cornered me in the parking lot. Her polite smile was gone. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she asked. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. No. I'd have enjoyed coming home and finding my yard exactly the way I left it. You could have talked to me. I couldn't help smiling. I did. You told me to think of it as contributing to the neighborhood. She looked away without answering. Over the next 2 weeks, contractors came and went almost daily. One quoted the demolition price. Another inspected whether parts of the structure could be salvaged. Denise filed paperwork, made phone calls, and even hired an attorney who eventually told her the same thing everyone else already had. The easement wasn't optional. The county wasn't bluffing. And every Monday another $500 would be added to the bill. Then, early one crisp Saturday morning, I woke to the unmistakable sound of heavy machinery backing into the neighborhood. I pulled open my blinds and watched a demolition crew position an excavator beside the very shed Denise had insisted would stand forever. She stood nearby with crossed arms, saying nothing, while workers removed shelves, gardening equipment, and decorative flower boxes one final time. As the first steel panel crashed onto the trailer, I realized this story was about to reach the moment neither of us would ever forget. Send part 3, and I'll finish the story with the demolition, Denise's final humiliation, the emotional resolution, and a powerful YouTube-style ending with a debate-provoking call to action. The excavator's engine echoed through the neighborhood just after sunrise, and for a few seconds nobody moved. The crew stood beside the massive aluminum shed, waiting for one last instruction, while Denise Holloway stared at it with the kind of expression people wear when reality finally catches up to them. Less than a month earlier, she'd stood on her porch telling me the building was permanent, that the HOA had spoken, that community projects mattered more than outdated property lines. Now the only people making decisions were wearing county safety vests. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto my front porch without saying a word. A few neighbors gathered quietly along the sidewalk, pretending to walk their dogs, but everyone knew exactly why they were there. The first hydraulic crunch was louder than I expected. The excavator's claw folded into the side of the shed, peeling away shiny gray panels as if they were made of cardboard. Screws popped loose, steel beams twisted, and within minutes the structure that had taken weeks to build looked like a crumpled soda can. Denise flinched every time another section collapsed. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I simply watched because, strangely enough, I wasn't feeling victorious anymore. I was feeling relieved. Relief is quieter than revenge. Relief doesn't celebrate someone else's loss. It simply breathes again after carrying a weight for too long. As workers loaded broken panels onto flatbed trailers, the concrete foundation was jackhammered apart piece by piece until nothing remained except dirt and scattered gravel. One of the contractors shook his head while passing me. "Beautiful building," he muttered. "Wrong place." I nodded. That's been the whole problem. By lunchtime, the entire shed had disappeared. The paver walkway that crossed into my yard was ripped out next, leaving fresh trenches where Denise had once insisted the neighborhood had every right to walk. A county inspector completed one final inspection that afternoon, signed the compliance paperwork, and drove away without ceremony. Just like that, months of arrogance ended with a signature and a departing pickup truck. Over the following week, landscapers filled the damaged ground with fresh topsoil, while I spent my evenings reseeding the lawn. It wasn't glamorous work. My boots were muddy, my back ached, and birds seemed determined to eat every handful of grass seed I spread. But somehow those quiet evenings meant more to me than winning any argument ever could. Mr. Alvarez wandered over carrying 2 cold bottles of root beer one afternoon and handed me one without saying much. We stood there looking at the empty space where the shed used to be. Finally, he chuckled. "Funny thing," he said. "The yard looks bigger than I remembered." "It always was," I answered. We laughed, and for the first time since coming home, the neighborhood actually felt like home again. Denise kept mostly to herself after that. She stopped walking around with the clipboard tucked under her arm. HOA meetings became noticeably shorter, and before long, rumors spread that she had quietly resigned as treasurer after several homeowners questioned how the entire project had been approved without a current survey. Whether she stepped down voluntarily or was pressured by the board, I honestly don't know. I never asked. One afternoon, several weeks later, our paths crossed at the mailbox. For a second, it felt like we were about to replay the same argument we'd had months before. But instead, she sighed and looked at the ground. "I thought I was helping the neighborhood," she said softly. I studied her face for a moment. The confidence was gone, replaced by something far more human. "Maybe you believe that," I replied. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped asking where your authority ended." She nodded almost imperceptibly before walking back across the street. That was the last real conversation we ever had. Looking back now, people sometimes ask if I went too far. They tell me I could have been more forgiving or worked out some compromise. Maybe they're right. Maybe there was another path. But here's the part people forget. I didn't start with lawyers, inspectors, or county violations. I started with a knock on a neighbor's door and a simple question. She had every opportunity to admit the mistake, move the shed, apologize, and we'd probably be laughing about it today over a backyard barbecue. Instead, she bet everything on the idea that power mattered more than facts, that a vote mattered more than the law, and that my silence while serving overseas meant I had somehow surrendered what belonged to my family. She lost that bet, not because I was smarter, richer, or louder, but because my father had taught me something long before I understood its value. Keep your records. Respect your land, and never assume that yesterday's paperwork has stopped protecting tomorrow's rights. Every spring now, when I mow across that stretch of grass, I think about him smiling in that dusty basement surrounded by old maps everyone else thought were worthless. Turns out he was right all along. Sometimes the quietest piece of paper in the room carries the loudest voice when the truth finally has its day. So now I want to hear from you. If you had come home and found a neighbor building on your property while hiding behind HOA approval, would you have handled it differently? Should I have accepted a compromise? Or did Denise bring every consequence on herself the moment she decided my absence gave her permission to take what wasn't hers? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this always divide people. And if you'd ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or a property dispute that tested your patience, share your experience below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real-life neighborhood stories, and I'll see you in the next one.